As the 2008 election approached, the unpopularity of George W. Bush had caused many Americans to seek different alternatives. And the two Democratic candidates that vied for the nomination were none other than Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton's wife, former First Lady, now Senator from New York, and a young, charming, charismatic black man from Chicago, Barack Hussein Obama. Okay? Um, Things remained reasonably close in the summer of 2008 for the Democrat nomination until eventually Barack Obama would get the nomination as he was seen as being more energetic and more enthusiastic. Barack Obama has this charisma about him. He's eloquent, he's well spoken, he's a likable guy. He just has this appeal for all Americans. People like Barack Obama. Even his political opponents may not agree with his politics, but generally they find him to be a likable guy. Okay? And in November 2008, he ran against John McCain, longtime senator from Arizona, former Vietnam prisoner of war, great American John McCain. Former Republican candidate in 2000 for the nomination of the Republican Party, beaten by George W. Bush. But otherwise, John McCain's one of the most heroic and likable Americans in political history in our country. He ran against Barack Obama. But what McCain had going against him was a portrayal that he would just continue unpopular Bush programs and that we would continue in a recession. More about that in a little bit. So, Barack Obama wins the 2008 election. He is the first minority president. You have a black man who's now president of the United States. Okay? Agree or disagree with his politics, the idea that now a black man can be president of the United States is a terrific example of something that's possible. Okay? It is now proven to be possible that a minority person can now be president. You have taken a pretty big step in American history. You're not just going to have a white guy be your president. You can be a black guy. And had Hillary Clinton beaten him, maybe a white woman. More on that thought in a second. Okay. Otherwise, though, Barack Obama's presidency would be marked with much of the same type of stalemate that George W. Bush and Bill Clinton had before him. You have Republicans in Congress leading majorities. You have Democrats who weren't quite organized. You have various different ideas and economic factors going into play. And you would have veritable stalemate. Okay, that would be pockmarks of Barack Obama's presidency. Otherwise, though, Barack Obama immediately gained the idea that he would push for the Affordable Care Act. So, what the Affordable Care Act is an idea of nationalized health care. Okay? In the midst of our economic recession, it became obvious that some things would have to change. See, we'll talk about healthcare in a second, but 2008 was a year that greatly affected American history. As it stands in 2020, because of this pandemic, we're seeing unprecedented economic times. Very difficult economic times where people have been put out of work, unemployment's rising, people aren't spending money. All kinds of things are and are not happening as we're trying to avoid contracting the coronavirus. Well, 2008 was deemed as having been the worst economic recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The 2008 recession was largely caused by various different factors in the mortgage industry. So the repeal of Glass-Steagall in the late 1990s meant that there's going to be less oversight into how mortgages are bundled and how they are underwritten. So what that basically means is if you were to take out a mortgage, you may not have to have as good a credit to get a loan. You might even be able to get a bigger amount and buy a bigger house. And the idea of buying a house with an adjustable interest rate now came into the foray. So many different mortgage companies, including one I used to work for, remain nameless, really likened the idea of there being adjustable rate mortgages or even payment option mortgages to where your interest rate would be very low, and after a matter of months, your interest rate would adjust depending upon how borrowing rates and overnight lending rates would go, or various different agreements. Well, that could mean that 6 months from now, your interest rate would be significantly higher. That means your payment would be significantly higher. And some of these mortgages offered interest only. You wouldn't have to pay into the principal. You would just pay the interest on it. Or one where there was an option to where you didn't even have to pay the full amount of interest on it. Okay? Adjustable rate mortgages and interest-only mortgages do have a place in borrowing. They're typically meant for people who may be into real estate flipping or anything else of the sort. You might buy a house, fix it up, and in a few months you're going to flip it and sell it for a profit. So in the meantime, you've taken out a short-term adjustable rate mortgage because you're probably not going to see the biggest effects of the adjustments. And you don't really need to pay the principal on it because principal doesn't go down in the first few years of the loan anyway. You're paying interest only. Why pay principal on it? Okay? That's what adjustable rate mortgages are meant for. That's what interest only loans are meant for. But at the time, people were taking out these adjustable rate mortgages as their main mortgage, a longer term mortgage. And it meant that people could now try and buy a house with worse credit, and they'd qualify for more based on the assumption that things are less. The problem became, well, as more people are approved when they really probably shouldn't be, you're creating an inflation of the real estate market. Say, for example, you want to buy a house for $200,000. That's the list price. Well, 12 other people also put in an offer for $200,000. So now you start a competitive process. Say, for example, you might get approved for $300,000 loan. You might put in an offer now of $250,000. Well, another person may put $260,000 and $275,000. So now all of a sudden this $200,000 house is going to be sold possibly for $300,000. You're creating an inflationary value of this home. Eventually that's going to come calling. And then another thing, these adjustable rate mortgages are now eventually going to have their adjustments. See, these people didn't necessarily realize, oh boy, when this thing adjusts, it might be a stark adjustment. My payment might go from being $800 a month now to $1,800 a month. Okay. Overnight, people's interest rates would adjust and they would be strapped in the first place, even with their lower payment. Now they're not able to make the minimum payments on the new adjustment rate. So you would have a rise in foreclosures and you would have a rise in people defaulting on their loans, causing a collapse of the housing market and threatening the entire strength of the financial markets and all of these mortgages. And many different mortgage companies who had bundled many of these very weak adjustable rate mortgages together and bought them were now paying severely because they bought a bunch of bad loans that should never have been written in the first place. So now you have a financial crisis where our whole housing factor in our mortgage business could drag the entire economy down. So now you have a recession that starts that puts people out of work. Inflation has gone up. People are claiming unemployment. They're not able to pay their bills. They're having to leave their house. And the market has tanked. You see the worst economic time since the Great Depression, all in 2008. I'm actually a byproduct of that recession in 2008. I wouldn't be here in front of you had it not been for 2008. I got laid off from a corporate job in 2008. And then when I found a job at a small recruiting company a few months later, I got laid off from that job because they lost their biggest client in the fall of 2008. I got laid off twice in 2008. That caused me to do a lot of soul searching and questioning about the things that I really enjoyed doing. I like people, I like helping people, and I love U.S. history. So I got a job at SMU recruiting high school and transfer students. Richland College is one of them, which I recruited. And in the meantime, I was able to obtain my master's degree to be able to obtain the certification to do what I'm doing now. Okay? I wouldn't be here had it not been for 2008. But that was a very difficult time. In the Bush and the Obama administration would enact government bailouts, most notably one called TARP, which is Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, which would bail out many of these different financial companies, insurance companies, auto manufacturers, companies being deemed as being too big to fail. So, a resurgence of the economy would have to happen. And that's basically how Barack Obama started his presidency. And he continued that with his Affordable Care Act movement, Obamacare. The idea of more of a nationalized health care was born under the Obama administration. But he met with quite a significant amount of pushback to pass through Obamacare because it would be deemed as maybe a federal bureaucratic program that would be deemed as being too big to where the amount of the federal oversight to see it would infringe upon people's lives. The idea of the Affordable Care Act is very noble. In practice, people's healthcare premiums have skyrocketed since it was actually enacted 10 years ago. You pay a lot more for your health insurance today than you did 10 years ago, and the products you get aren't as good. So the Affordable Care Act was eventually repealed a number of years later by the next president. More on him in a little bit. Otherwise, though, Barack Obama had run on a campaign that there would be hope and change. We're going to change from the warlike policies enacted under Bush, and we're going to redirect some of our approach. We're going to think of the people first, and we're going to do various different things. There was a backlash among the most financially conservative Republicans, creating a Tea Party movement. Those who label themselves as the Tea Party, who resist paying higher taxes and they resist the expansion of federal government. Conversely, there was an Occupy Wall Street movement who, on the opposite side of the spectrum, resisted the seemingly unfair practices of major investment firms and benefiting the wealthiest of Americans instead of the 99%. That's where you hear the term, the 1% control everything, that sort of a thing, okay? So Obama's administration coincided with movements in the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, okay? Of course, Barack Obama would have to run for re-election in 2012. And he ran against Mitt Romney, former governor of Massachusetts, a Mormon from Utah originally, who would eventually move back to Utah and is now a current senator from Utah. In a reasonably close election, Barack Obama wins his bid for re-election, but not without controversy. See, Barack Obama, as I had mentioned a little bit ago, saw much of the same problem that Bush and Clinton had. Hyperpartisanship. So you would have Republican-controlled Congresses that would block much of Obama's movement. Just like Bush had many problems with a lot of Democrats during his presidency. Just like Clinton saw a lot of trouble with Republicans in his. Okay? So, trying to reform gun control measures or immigration measures was met with quite a significant amount of pushback. Okay? So, what you saw under Barack Obama's presidency was a significant amount of roadblocks to anything being done. A lot of pushback against Obamacare, a lot of pushback against immigration reform and otherwise. In that's just kind of a sign of the times. Because Donald Trump sees pushback, Bush saw it, Clinton saw it. It's just kind of the sign of the times. And that's one of the balances in our country. We don't want to go too far one way or the other. So a lot of people argue that a do-nothing Congress where things are blocked, the president gets blocked, Congress gets blocked and vetoed, or anything else of the sort, is a terrible thing. I don't think it's so terribly bad. And part of the reason why I say that is because our country, historically, when we are aligned too far to the right or too far to the left, we go and swing in such a direction that it becomes detrimental to the overall benefit of most Americans. America is a center country. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. We may be center right, maybe center left, but we are more towards the middle. The overwhelming majority of us benefit from moderate politics to where concessions are made to where the overwhelming majority of us benefit. You almost never know it because you see the extremes on one side yelling at each other, and that's all you see in the news or on Facebook or anything else of the sort, when in reality, most of us are here. But it's these elements that scream at each other, and they influence those of us in here. But we're still here. I would argue that the majority of us who supposedly vehemently disagree are pretty similar in a lot of different ways. Okay? But that was a hallmark of the time leading into Barack Obama's presidency and then eventually the very contentious election of 2016.